The year 1880 gifted the world a portrait that would for generations be hailed as an undisputed masterpiece, a testament to an era's elegance and the formidable presence of its subject. It depicted a figure of immense societal standing, whose gaze, rendered with breathtaking artistry, seemed to hold the very essence of Victorian grace and prosperity. This artwork quickly ascended to an iconic status, not merely as a painting, but as a visual cornerstone of historical understanding, a silent, eloquent symbol of the period's most cherished values and the unblemished ideals of its elite. For over a century, it adorned prestigious halls, its narrative unchallenged, its beauty unquestioned, its subject revered without a shadow of doubt. It was the face of an age, etched in oil and canvas, radiating an aura of unwavering rectitude and profound societal contribution. Yet, even the most steadfast monuments eventually encounter the relentless march of time and the ever-evolving tools of scrutiny. A new generation of historians, equipped with technologies unimaginable to their predecessors, embarked on a routine re-evaluation of celebrated works. Leading this meticulous endeavor was Dr. Anya Sharma, a scholar known for her quiet brilliance and an almost uncanny ability to perceive the subtle currents beneath the surface of historical narratives. Her team, operating in a state-of-the-art digital imaging lab, began the painstaking process of scanning the 1880 portrait, employing advanced techniques designed to uncover every nuance, every brushstroke, every layer beneath the varnish. During these initial high-resolution scans, a minuscule anomaly surfaced within the painting's background. It was so faint, so utterly insignificant in its scale, that it was almost immediately dismissed by the junior technicians as a mere flaw in the original paint, perhaps a tiny speck of dust trapped beneath a final glaze, or even a fleeting digital artifact caused by the intricate scanning process itself. The initial reports flagged it, but with a note of confident disregard. It was nothing, a phantom of the digital realm, a whisper that held no weight against the grandeur of the canvas. But Dr. Sharma, with her finely honed intuition, found herself experiencing a subtle, persistent feeling of unease. The anomaly, despite its trivial appearance, snagged at her attention, a tiny burr on the fabric of her otherwise calm academic focus. It was an insistence, quiet yet unyielding, that this minor detail, this almost imperceptible smudge, held more meaning than her logical mind or her team's initial assessment would allow. There was no scientific basis for her feeling, just a deep professional hunch that had served her well through countless historical puzzles. It was a sense that something was subtly, profoundly out of place, a discord in the visual symphony of the portrait. From this faint, almost imperceptible whisper, the first hint of a deeper truth began to emerge, not yet fully formed, but undeniably present. It suggested that the portrait, in all its celebrated glory, and by extension, the historical narrative it had so powerfully represented for generations, might be subtly, yet significantly, misleading. This wasn't about a forgery or a deliberate alteration. It was about the potential for a quiet, long-standing misdirection, a carefully constructed illusion maintained by time and unquestioning admiration. A profound sense of impending revelation started to permeate the sterile atmosphere of the lab, a quiet hum of anticipation for a discovery that promised to shake the very foundations of what was considered historical fact. The exact nature or impact of this hidden detail remained tantalizingly veiled, a mystery waiting to unfold, but its potential to rewrite history was already palpable. The initial, almost imperceptible offense was not a direct lie, but rather the portrait's long-standing, unchallenged narrative itself, a quiet deception perpetuated not by malice, but by the sheer weight of time, academic consensus, and the powerful allure of an idealized image. For decades, the painting had been presented as an unvarnished truth, a window into a bygone era, its story accepted without rigorous cross-examination, against the full spectrum of historical possibilities. This unquestioning acceptance, in hindsight, felt like a silent complicity in a narrative that might have been less complete, less honest, than everyone believed. What surprised her colleagues most was Dr. Sharma's calm, almost serene approach to this unfolding mystery. While the dramatic potential of their discovery was immense, threatening to overturn decades of established historical understanding, Anya moved with methodical precision. There was no theatrical urgency, no breathless pronouncements, only a quiet, relentless pursuit of verification. Her composure, in stark contrast to the potential for academic upheaval, served as a steady anchor for the team, assuring them that this was not about sensationalism, but about the unyielding pursuit of truth. The narrative subtly suggested that the grand consequence awaiting them would be nothing less than the unraveling of a carefully constructed historical image, a persona meticulously built and maintained, but its full devastating impact remained tantalizingly veiled, a distant thunder on the horizon. This journey to uncover the hidden truth was more than an academic exercise. It was a profound testament to the enduring, often inconvenient power of historical truth. It reminded them that history was not a static photograph, but a living, breathing tapestry, constantly being rewoven with new threads of evidence and fresh perspectives. The portrait, once a symbol of an era's certainty, was slowly transforming into a silent witness to a potential reinterpretation, a silent challenge to the very notion of a fixed historical reality. The stage was now set, not for a simple correction, but for a profound reevaluation that would resonate far beyond the confines of their lab. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Stepping back from the tantalizing anomaly, we journey now to the very heart of the world that birthed the enigmatic portrait, the late 19th century. Imagine the 1880s, an era shimmering with both opulent grandeur and stark social stratification, a period often romanticized as the Gilded Age. It was a time when appearances were not merely important, they were paramount, a meticulously crafted facade that dictated one's standing, influence, and legacy. Society was a grand theater where wealth and virtue were publicly displayed, and the elite, draped in their finest silks and their most carefully curated reputations, played their roles with unwavering dedication. This was a world defined by its rigid class structures, where the upper echelons of society held immense power and were expected to embody an almost mythical ideal of success, philanthropy, and moral rectitude. For prominent figures, the expectation was to project an image of impeccable character, unwavering integrity, and boundless generosity. Any deviation, any hint of impropriety, could shatter a carefully constructed life faster than glass. It was in this environment of heightened social scrutiny and aspirational perfection that our portrait's subject emerged, a towering figure whose name, even decades later, resonated with reverence. Let us call her Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance was not merely wealthy, she was celebrated. A formidable industrialist who had inherited and vastly expanded her family's textile empire, she was equally renowned for her extensive philanthropic endeavors, her patronage of the arts, and her tireless work for women's suffrage. At least this was the established narrative. Her life story, meticulously documented in countless biographies, newspaper eulogies, and academic texts, painted a picture of a true paragon of virtue, a woman who seamlessly blended shrewd business acumen with an unwavering commitment to societal betterment. She was presented as the embodiment of success, a titan of industry with a heart of gold, reflecting the very best values of her era. Her portrait, commissioned during the zenith of her public adoration, was intended to immortalize this very image. The artist chosen for this monumental task was none other than the celebrated Antoine Dubois, a master of capturing the essence of the elite. Dubois was known for his uncanny ability to infuse his subjects with an almost ethereal glow, often through idealized portrayals that not only flattered but actively reinforced and elevated their public image. His brushstrokes were said to reveal the soul, yet they also served as powerful tools in the grand machinery of reputation building. The Vance portrait, a triumph of Dubois' skill, quickly became a cornerstone of historical understanding, a visual testament to Eleanor's grace, influence, and the supposed moral fiber of her time. The historical consensus surrounding both the portrait and its subject was absolute. deeply ingrained in textbooks and public consciousness for generations. To question it would be to question the very fabric of historical truth. Dr. Anya Sharma, however, possessed a mind that thrived on questioning. Her initial academic fascination with the late 19th century, particularly with figures like Eleanor Vance, had been born of genuine admiration. She had immersed herself in the period, drawn to its complexities, and the dramatic shifts it represented. For years, she had lectured on Vance, citing her as a prime example of female empowerment and ethical capitalism. Yet, even during those years of confident scholarship, subtle, almost subconscious tensions had begun to form in the quiet corners of her mind as she delved deeper into the established records. The portrait, for all its celebrated beauty, had always held a certain stillness, an almost too perfect composure that, upon closer inspection, felt less like natural serenity and more like a carefully constructed mask. It wasn't a definitive suspicion, not yet. It was more akin to a persistent hum beneath the surface of the grand narrative, a faint dissonance in the symphony of Eleanor Vance's acclaimed life. While the portrait was universally celebrated, Anya had occasionally stumbled upon minor inconsistencies or gaps in the historical record that had always felt slightly off. A sudden, unexplained shift in Vance's business dealings, a brief, almost erased mention of a dispute with a former associate, or peculiar silence surrounding a particular year in her personal life. These were not red flags, merely faint shadows in the brilliant light of her legend, easily dismissed by previous scholars as inconsequential or simply missing data. But for Anya, they had always lingered, like dust motes caught in a beam of sunlight, visible only when the angle was just right. She had attributed these feelings to the inherent challenges of historical research, the incomplete nature of any past record. Yet, the unease persisted, a quiet insistence that the story, as it was told, was too neat, too pristine. Now, with the digital anomaly discovered in the portrait itself, these old, faint whispers of doubt began to coalesce, gaining a new, unsettling resonance. The world, as it appeared in the 1880s, was a masterclass in illusion, and Anya was beginning to suspect that Eleanor Vance and her celebrated portrait might have been its most exquisite deception. The stage was set, the revered status of both the artwork and its subject firmly established, making the potential revelation awaiting them all the more devastatingly impactful. The idealized image of the portrait subject, a figure of profound public admiration, was not an accidental byproduct of their era, but a meticulously constructed edifice, built brick by brick through carefully curated narratives and societal expectation. From the moment of their rise to prominence, every biography, every public statement, and every familial account reinforced a singular, unwavering vision of virtue, success, and philanthropic devotion. Early historians, often writing with the benefit of hindsight, but lacking the critical distance afforded by modern methodologies, drew heavily from these primary sources, solidifying a narrative that championed the subject as an unimpeachable paragon. Inconvenient details, minor missteps, or even legitimate criticisms were not overtly suppressed, but rather subtly omitted, glossed over, or reframed within a broader context of an ultimately benevolent character. The narrative became less a historical record and more a piece of hagiography, a testament to the power of reputation in a world obsessed with appearances. The subject's family, a formidable dynasty with significant influence in both social and economic spheres, played an instrumental role in this historical crafting. Their considerable resources and social standing allowed them to shape public perception, commissioning celebratory articles, sponsoring commemorative works, and ensuring that their patriarch's legacy remained untarnished. The intricate web of their social circle, comprising other powerful families and influential figures, acted as an echo chamber, amplifying the positive narrative and subtly silencing any dissenting voices. Anecdotes of the subject's profound generosity, for instance, were widely circulated and celebrated, tales of grand donations to hospitals, libraries, and orphanages. These stories, while undeniably true in their surface-level facts, often lacked the deeper context of how the immense wealth funding these endeavors was accumulated, or the less visible, sometimes ruthless, business practices that underpinned their financial empire. These were the foundations of the accepted truth, laid deep and cemented by decades of repetition. For many historians, including Dr. Sharma, this rigidity had long been a source of quiet frustration, an old resentment born from the academic struggle against narratives that had become almost sacrosanct, immune to critical re-examination. The field at times seemed more inclined to preserve cherished myths than to excavate the uncomfortable nuances of genuine human complexity. Yet, even as the grand narrative solidified, faint dissonances, like archival whispers, occasionally broke through the carefully constructed silence. These were the unseen cracks, minor historical discrepancies that, in isolation, seemed insignificant, easily dismissed, or simply too obscure to challenge the overwhelming weight of the established story. Consider, for example, a fleeting mention in a forgotten contemporary's diary, describing a heated exchange with the revered subject that painted a less flattering picture of their temperament, quickly brushed aside as personal envy or misinterpretation, or perhaps an obscure newspaper clipping from a rival town, detailing a minor business scandal involving the subject's earliest ventures, which never gained traction in the larger metropolitan press and was soon relegated to the dustbin of local history. There were also faint, smudged entries in old municipal records, hinting at land disputes or labor issues that contradicted the public image of a fair and benevolent employer, but these were always attributed to clerical errors or the complexities of nascent industrial growth. More poignantly, a few faded letters from disgruntled former employees, discovered decades later in unrelated family archives, spoke of harsh working conditions and broken promises, but their testimonies were deemed unreliable, lacking corroboration against the backdrop of glowing public accolades. These were not smoking guns, they were mere wisps of smoke, easily fanned away by the prevailing winds of historical consensus. The sheer momentum of the dominant narrative simply overwhelmed these fragile counter-narratives. Past historians, operating without the benefit of today's digital tools or the specific impetus that Dr. Sharma's team now possessed, saw these whispers as isolated anomalies, not as interconnected threads of a larger, hidden tapestry. They were filed away, footnoted perhaps, but never allowed to genuinely challenge the bedrock assumptions about the subject's character or the era's understanding of progress. These cracks, though unseen by the mainstream, had always existed, embedded in the overlooked corners of the past, waiting patiently for a new generation of investigators to finally connect the dots and expose the quiet, persistent deception that had defined a historical epoch. The stage was set, not for a sudden revelation, but for the progressive unraveling of a carefully maintained illusion. The stage was set, not for a sudden revelation, but for the progressive unraveling of a carefully maintained illusion. As Dr. Sharma and her dedicated team delved deeper, the individual whispers and cracks began to coalesce, forming a more coherent, disturbing picture. What initially seemed like isolated anomalies, easily explained away by the vagaries of historical record-keeping or the biases of minor figures, now started to accumulate into a discernible pattern, slowly but surely eroding confidence in the accepted narrative. It was an emotional erosion, a slow gnawing at the foundations of what they, and generations before them, had believed to be immutable truth. Each small episode, when viewed through a fresh lens and in relation to others, added another layer of doubt, like drops of acid steadily dissolving a carefully polished surface. One prominent example emerged from a re-examination of the subject's philanthropic endeavors. Public records lauded their immense generosity, particularly in funding public works and charitable institutions. Yet, a deeper dive into municipal archives, cross-referenced with the financial ledgers of the subject's own enterprises, revealed a series of broken promises. There were pledges of significant donations that were either drastically reduced years later without public announcement or outright rescinded after initial fanfare, the funds quietly diverted to personal ventures. These were not outright swindles, but rather subtle shifts in commitment, masked by the sheer volume of other, more visible acts of charity. While the public remembered the grand announcements, the quiet retractions went largely unnoticed, leaving behind a trail of unfulfilled expectations and projects that faltered due to sudden lack of promised support. This pattern suggested a calculated manipulation of public perception, where the intent to donate was often as important as the actual follow-through, a performative benevolence designed to bolster an image rather than genuinely alleviate need. Further investigation uncovered painful silences in the historical documents surrounding the subject's personal life and business dealings. Biographies, even the most comprehensive ones, often glossed over entire years, or provided only vague, unspecific details about certain periods. For instance, a 2-year span in the subject's mid-30s, typically a period of significant professional expansion, was curiously barren of specific accomplishments or even detailed personal correspondence. The official narrative attributed this to a period of quiet contemplation or a family bereavement. But Dr. Sharma's team found no corroborating evidence for prolonged mourning or retreat. Instead, fragmented, almost deliberately obscured records hinted at a period of intense legal battles, possibly involving a contentious partnership dissolution or a scandalous personal affair that was meticulously scrubbed from public memory. These silences were not accidental omissions. They felt like deliberate voids, carefully crafted lacunae in the historical record, designed to protect the subject's carefully cultivated reputation from any potential blemish. The absence of information in this context became as telling as its presence. Perhaps most unsettling were the glimpses of emotional aggression and manipulative behaviors that surfaced from newly unearthed private correspondence and the forgotten testimonies of less prominent figures within the subject's orbit. Letters exchanged between the subject and their business associates, previously dismissed as mere expressions of Victorian-era assertiveness, now revealed a chilling pattern of intimidation and control. Subtle threats of financial ruin, veiled allusions to public disgrace, and the strategic deployment of social influence were evident in the tone and content of these exchanges. These were not the actions of a benevolent leader, but of a shrewd, often ruthless individual willing to exert immense pressure to achieve their aims. One particularly poignant discovery involved the memoirs of a former personal assistant, written years after the subject's death and never published, which detailed instances of severe emotional abuse, public humiliation, and systematic gaslighting designed to maintain absolute loyalty and control. These accounts, previously disregarded as the bitter ramblings of a disgruntled subordinate, now resonated with a terrifying authenticity when viewed alongside the other accumulating anomalies. These were not isolated incidents, but rather persistent patterns of behavior. The subject, once a monolithic figure of virtue, began to emerge as a character far more complex, deeply flawed, and, at times, disturbingly calculating than previously believed. The cumulative effect of these revelations was profound. Each instance on its own might have been dismissed as an aberration, a momentary lapse in an otherwise exemplary life. But when pieced together, they painted a picture of a persona meticulously constructed and ruthlessly maintained, often at the expense of others and at odds with the public image. The idealized figure began to fray at the edges, revealing a human being driven by ambition and self-preservation, capable of actions that directly contradicted the very values they publicly espoused. This slow, inexorable accumulation of inconsistencies began to highlight a deeper systemic issue: the historical community's inadvertent perpetuation of a disrespect for truth. And, by rigidly adhering to the established narrative, by dismissing every dissenting whisper and every inconvenient silence, historians had, perhaps unknowingly, become complicit in maintaining a partial, sanitized version of the past. The comfort of the familiar narrative had often outweighed the arduous, uncomfortable pursuit of a more complete, nuanced reality. This created a growing internal struggle among a small but dedicated group of historians, led by Dr. Sharma. They grappled with the cognitive dissonance of confronting these accumulating inconsistencies, knowing that challenging such a revered figure would invite immense scrutiny and potential backlash. The corrosion here was not just of the subject's idealized image, but of the very trust placed in the historical record itself. The ground was slowly but surely becoming fertile for a radical reinterpretation, one that would demand a reckoning with the past's carefully guarded secrets and the historical profession's own biases. The quiet certainty that had long surrounded the portrait and its subject was now giving way to a profound, unsettling doubt, a prelude to the dramatic revelations yet to come. The accumulation of these once dismissed anomalies, meticulously gathered and cross-referenced by Dr. Sharma's team, could no longer be contained within the quiet confines of their research lab. What began as private doubts and whispered hypotheses had solidified into a coherent, albeit still nascent, counter-narrative. The time came when these findings, however preliminary, demanded to be aired, to be tested against the prevailing wisdom. Their initial attempts to present their growing skepticism, to introduce these unsettling nuances into academic discussions, were met not with outright hostility, but with a more insidious form of resistance, a polite but firm wall of institutional inertia and entrenched belief. At departmental seminars, during panel discussions at conferences, and in the peer review process of early papers outlining their methodology, the discussions around their work were initially veiled. Colleagues, many of whom had built their careers on the very narrative Dr. Sharma's team was now questioning, offered thinly disguised criticisms. There were murmurs about sensationalism, warnings against revisionism for its own sake, and suggestions that their digital tools were perhaps generating artifacts rather than revelations. The social pressures were immense, subtle yet pervasive. Established academics, guardians of the historical canon, often saw challenges to long-held truths not as intellectual progress, but as an affront to their own scholarship, a destabilization of the very foundations upon which their professional reputations rested. The institutions themselves, with their carefully curated collections and public narratives, were slow to embrace anything that might necessitate a radical recontextualization of their prized exhibits. Judgments from peers became more pronounced. While no one openly accused Dr. Sharma of malicious intent, there was a palpable questioning of her motives, a quiet insinuation that perhaps the allure of a groundbreaking discovery was clouding her academic rigor. Some colleagues, who had once been mentors or allies, began to keep a subtle distance, uncomfortable with the controversy her team was stirring. The psychological environment within the history department, once a vibrant hub of intellectual exchange, grew heavy and suffocating for the dissenting historians. Every argument felt like an uphill battle. Every piece of evidence painstakingly unearthed seemed to evaporate under the weight of decades of accepted wisdom. They were not merely presenting new data, they were challenging an entire epistemology, a way of seeing the past that had been ingrained for generations. The air was thick with unspoken skepticism, with a quiet expectation that this phase of radical inquiry would eventually pass, and order would be restored. It wasn't just the overt dismissals that wore on them, it was the subtle condescension, the gentle suggestions to focus on more fruitful avenues of research, the way their meticulously sourced counter-evidence was often met with a dismissive wave or a patronizing smile. Dr. Sharma found herself increasingly isolated, her once eager team feeling the brunt of academic ostracization. The very act of questioning, which should have been the bedrock of historical inquiry, was now perceived by many as an act of intellectual rebellion, almost sacrilege. The weight of challenging a narrative that had been taught in classrooms, celebrated in museums, and enshrined in countless scholarly texts for over a century was immense. Each presentation, each published article, became a psychological ordeal, knowing it would be dissected not just for its academic merit, but for its audacity. The pressure to abandon their line of inquiry, to simply revert to the comfortable, accepted truths, was a constant, gnawing presence. They grappled with moments of self-doubt, wondering if perhaps they were indeed chasing shadows, succumbing to confirmation bias, or misinterpreting ambiguities. Yet, each time they revisited their collected evidence, the broken promises, the painful silences, the subtle aggressions unearthed from forgotten archives, the conviction returned, stronger than before. The discrepancies were too numerous, too consistent, to be mere coincidence or misinterpretation. They were not seeking to tear down history but to truly understand it, even if that understanding proved deeply unsettling to the established order. In the midst of this escalating academic conflict, the grand 1880 portrait, the very genesis of their inquiry, stood as a silent, serene symbol, seemingly untouched by the intellectual storm raging around it. Yet, for Dr. Sharma and her team, it had transformed. No longer merely a beautiful artifact or a revered historical document, it had become a symbolic battleground, its serene surface a deceptive veneer over the brewing intellectual war. Every brushstroke, every shadow, every carefully rendered detail now seemed to hold a double meaning, a quiet defiance of the accepted truth. The subject's confident gaze, once interpreted as a sign of virtuous authority, now seemed to carry an unsettling ambiguity, a hint of something carefully concealed. The background, where the initial anomaly had been detected, pulsed with unrevealed secrets, a silent taunt to those who dared to look beyond the superficial. The tensions were not yet those of personal betrayal, not the dramatic confrontations of melodrama, but something far more profound and intellectually charged. This was the intense friction between the comforting, established historical truth, a truth that had woven itself into the fabric of national identity and academic discourse, and the emerging, uncomfortable reality that Dr. Sharma's team was painstakingly assembling. The stakes were no longer just about a single historical figure. They were about the integrity of historical methodology, the willingness of a discipline to confront its own blind spots, and the courage to rewrite narratives, no matter how cherished. The air in their lab was thick not just with the hum of advanced machinery, but with the palpable sense of an impending clash. The quiet whispers had become loud accusations. The subtle cracks now threatened to cleave the very foundation of an era's understanding. The stage was set for a confrontation, not with individuals, but with an entire edifice of historical consensus, and the portrait, in its magnificent stoic silence, awaited its role as both witness and catalyst. The subtle cracks in the historical edifice, once dismissed as mere academic curiosities, began to widen under the persistent scrutiny of Dr. Sharma's team, provoking a fierce and increasingly desperate resistance from the entrenched establishment. What started as scholarly skepticism soon morphed into outright hostility, as defenders of the long-held narrative found themselves making graver errors in their attempts to discredit the new line of inquiry. Their initial dismissal of the early findings as speculative or sensationalist gave way to more rigid, almost dogmatic rejections of any evidence that challenged their foundational beliefs. Academic journals, once open to rigorous debate, suddenly became less receptive to submissions from Dr. Sharma's circle, their reviews laced with thinly veiled accusations of revisionism for revisionism's sake. Informal networks within the historical community, traditionally a source of collaboration, now felt like a suffocating web designed to isolate and undermine. These were not merely intellectual disagreements. They were battles for the very soul of historical interpretation. The implacable nature of the old guard became glaringly apparent in public forums and private correspondences. Historians who had built their entire careers on the veneration of the portrait subject, who had authored definitive biographies and curated celebrated exhibitions, found their professional identities threatened. Their vested interests in maintaining the status quo were no longer subtle. They manifested as a stubborn refusal to engage with new data, a dismissive wave of the hand at any mention of the archival whispers Dr. Sharma's team had painstakingly unearthed. They resorted to questioning the methodology, the motives, and even the professional integrity of Dr. Sharma and her colleagues, often without offering substantive counterarguments beyond the assertion of established fact. One particularly scathing editorial, published in a respected historical review, subtly accused the team of lacking respect for foundational scholarship, implying a dangerous trend towards deconstruction without reconstruction. This was a clear attempt to marginalize, to paint them as outliers whose work would ultimately be forgotten once the fleeting interest in their provocative theories subsided. Dr. Sharma, a scholar known for her measured patience and meticulous approach, found her resolve tested to its limits. The team had exhausted the avenues of purely theoretical debates and the presentation of fragmented, albeit compelling, evidence. Every new piece of documentation they brought forward, every reinterpretation of an existing source, was met with a wall of skepticism, a preemptive dismissal that refused to truly consider the implications. They were caught in a frustrating loop, where their attempts to introduce nuance were perceived as attacks, and their calls for a more complete historical truth were branded as disruptive. The pressure to abandon their research, to conform to the dominant view, and simply let the established narrative stand, became immense. There were quiet suggestions from mentors concerned for their careers to pivot to less controversial topics. Funding bodies, sensitive to academic politics, became noticeably cooler in their responses. The psychological toll was heavy, a constant, gnawing feeling of battling against an invisible yet overwhelmingly powerful current. They were on the brink, not of giving up, but of realizing that conventional warfare would not win this particular battle. They needed something undeniable, something that transcended interpretation and left no room for doubt. They needed irrefutable proof. It became increasingly clear to the viewer, watching this intellectual tug-of-war unfold, that something very big was about to happen. The narrative shifted, narrowing its focus with an almost palpable intensity, away from the endless debates and back to the genesis of their entire inquiry, the 1880 portrait itself. It was there, within the canvas, that the initial anomaly had been detected, a detail so minuscule it had been dismissed as an optical illusion or a painter's oversight. Now, however, that faint, almost imperceptible blemish beckoned like a silent oracle, holding the promise of the definitive answer. The team, pushed to their intellectual and emotional limits, knew that the time for academic politeness had passed. The moment for a decisive strike, a definitive revelation, was at hand. The decision was made, not lightly, but with a shared sense of conviction and urgency, to pursue the most advanced forms of digital analysis available. This was no longer about rereading old texts or re-examining dusty archives. It was about peering into the very fabric of the painting with technology that could expose secrets hidden from the naked eye for over a century. Their target was precise. That anomalous detail, the tiny, almost invisible speck in the background that had first triggered Dr. Sharma's persistent unease. They would employ hyperspectral imaging, X-ray fluorescence, and ultra-high-resolution microscopy, pushing the boundaries of art-historical science. These techniques, capable of revealing underlying layers, pigments, and even the minutest brushstrokes, promised to strip away the veneer of time and artistic intent. The laboratory, once a quiet space of contemplation, transformed into a high-stakes command center, buzzing with hushed anticipation. The air crackled with a unique blend of scientific rigor and almost desperate hope. Every wire, every sensor, every digital feed was a conduit to a truth that lay buried deep within the canvas, a truth that could either vindicate their relentless pursuit or condemn them to the fringes of academic obscurity. The stage was now set, not for a subtle unraveling, but for a dramatic rupture, where technology would finally reveal what human eyes and conventional research could not, preparing the ground for an explosive, undeniable truth. The storm was not just gathering, it was about to break directly over the serene, deceptive surface of that renowned 1880 portrait. The hum of the sophisticated machinery filled the sterile laboratory, a low, constant thrumming that underscored the immense pressure in the room. Dr. Anya Sharma stood before a bank of monitors, her gaze fixed, her posture rigid, every fiber of her being attuned to the pixels dancing across the screens. Beside her, Dr. Ben Carter, the imaging specialist, meticulously adjusted parameters, his fingers gliding over the console with practiced precision. The hyperspectral imager, a marvel of modern technology, was methodically scanning the canvas, layer by painstaking layer, analyzing the chemical composition of the pigments, searching for anomalies beneath the surface. X-ray fluorescence maps were simultaneously generating, revealing the elemental composition, hinting at hidden underdrawings or repairs. But it was the ultra-high-resolution microscopy, zoomed in to an almost molecular level on that specific, previously dismissed speck, that held their collective breath captive. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light on the screens and the occasional hushed murmur from a team member. The initial scans had already provided tantalizing glimpses, faint spectral signatures that suggested something was indeed different in that tiny patch of background. Not a flaw, not an optical illusion, but an intentional, albeit masterfully concealed, element. The air grew thick with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What if they were wrong? What if, after all this, it was truly nothing more than a trick of light or a microscopic imperfection in the canvas? The thought was a cold hand squeezing Dr. Sharma's heart, but her academic instincts, honed over decades, told her otherwise. That persistent unease had been more than a feeling. It had been a premonition, a quiet insistence that something profound lay hidden. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the image on the largest monitor began to resolve itself. Ben had been meticulously refining the focus, enhancing contrast, applying algorithms to strip away the optical noise of a century and a half. What had been a blurry smudge, a mere textural inconsistency in the dark, richly painted background, started to coalesce. A shape emerged, then contours, and finally, with a collective, sharp intake of breath, a distinct, undeniable form. It wasn't a crack in the paint, nor a stray brushstroke, but rather a deliberate, minuscule inclusion, painted with such exquisite subtlety that it had eluded generations of art historians, hidden in plain sight, a silent challenge to the observant eye. The detail that changed everything was a small, almost imperceptible symbol, no larger than a thumbnail, artfully blended into the intricate pattern of a velvet curtain behind the portrait's esteemed subject. At first glance it appeared to be merely an abstract decorative flourish, another element in the opulent background, easily dismissed. But as the digital magnification sharpened, revealing the individual brushstrokes and the precise interplay of light and shadow, its true nature became horrifyingly clear. It was a stylized, inverted triangle, subtly interwoven with a serpent-like coil, a symbol instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with the darker, more secretive undercurrents of the late 19th century. This was not a symbol of philanthropy or societal grace. This was the sigil of a notorious, albeit underground, fraternal order, known for its ruthless acquisition of wealth through questionable means, an organization whispered to be involved in everything from illicit trade to political manipulation, cloaked in a veil of secrecy and power. The implications hit them with the force of a physical blow reverberating through the hushed lab. The celebrated subject of the portrait, a man revered as a pillar of industry and a benevolent patron of the arts, had publicly disavowed any association with such groups. His entire public image, meticulously constructed and upheld for over a century, was built upon a foundation of unimpeachable integrity and moral rectitude. Yet here, staring back at them from the very canvas that immortalized his public persona, was undeniable proof of a hidden allegiance, a secret life antithetical to everything he represented. The tiny symbol was not just a detail, it was a confession, a silent scream across time. It mocked the viewer, a triumphant wink from the past, daring anyone to look closely enough to uncover the truth of his clandestine affiliations. Dr. Sharma felt a chill run down her spine, not from the cool air of the lab, but from the profound sense of betrayal emanating from the image. This was the final betrayal by the portrait's original intent. It was not merely an idealized depiction, it was a deliberate act of deception, a carefully orchestrated lie painted into existence, intended to mislead and obscure. The artist, famed for his loyalty to his patrons, must have been complicit, a silent co-conspirator in this grand illusion, his skill used to weave deceit into beauty. The extreme decision to embed such a damning piece of evidence, yet make it almost impossible to discern, spoke volumes about the subject's arrogance, or perhaps his desperate need to leave some trace of his true self, however obscure, for posterity. It was an act of audacious defiance against the very public whose admiration he so carefully cultivated, a testament to his hidden power. The silence in the lab was profound, broken only by the persistent hum of the machines. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply stared, absorbing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed, each grappling with the seismic shift in their understanding. The serene, dignified face of the subject, once a symbol of an era's highest ideals, now seemed to leer, a mask of virtue barely concealing a darker, more sinister truth. The entire emotional and intellectual trajectory of their painstaking research had just been irrevocably altered. What began as an academic pursuit, a quiet challenge to historical orthodoxy, had transformed into something far more visceral, a profound reevaluation not just of a man, but of the very nature of truth and deception in the historical record. The weight of generations of scholarship, built upon a foundation now revealed to be riddled with deceit, pressed down upon them. They had not just found a detail, they had unearthed a ghost, a secret that had festered in the shadows for over 100 years, finally brought into the harsh light of modern scrutiny. The portrait, once a testament to grandeur, was now an indictment. The storm, indeed, had broken, not with a violent crash, but with the chilling, silent clarity of an image resolving on a screen. The laboratory, moments before a crucible of frantic anticipation, fell into an almost sacred hush. Dr. Sharma and her team stared, transfixed, at the colossal display, where the previously dismissed speck in the portrait's background now loomed, magnified 1,000-fold. It was not a flaw, nor an optical illusion, but an unmistakable, deliberate insertion. A miniature, almost imperceptible inscription, intricately woven into the pattern of the wallpaper behind the subject's left shoulder. Its message, once revealed through spectral analysis and careful digital reconstruction, was a devastating whisper from the past, a direct contradiction to the subject's public persona, a damning testament to a secret life. The script, rendered in a stylized hand, read simply, "The true measure of a man is not his public face, but the shadows he keeps hidden." The initial reaction was a collective gasp, quickly followed by a heavy, disbelieving silence. Dr. Sharma felt a peculiar mix of vindication and profound sorrow. The pain was for the years of historical obfuscation, the relief for the undeniable truth finally brought to light. Shock reverberated through them at the sheer audacity of the deception, and a renewed strength surged, knowing they now held the unassailable proof. This was not a minor correction. It was a fundamental shift, a seismic event in the annals of art history and biographical study. The portrait, once a symbol of grace and societal virtue, now screamed a silent accusation, its serene surface forever tainted by the microscopic confession it had held captive for over a century. The subject, a paragon of virtue, was suddenly unveiled as a master of duplicity, his carefully constructed legacy crumbling under the weight of a few hidden words. Presenting this irrefutable evidence to the wider academic community was, as expected, met with a complex wave of reactions. The initial scholarly seminar, held in a packed auditorium, began with an atmosphere of skepticism, even polite condescension. But as Dr. Sharma meticulously unveiled the process, the technology, and finally, the undeniable image of the inscription, the mood shifted dramatically. Faces contorted in disbelief, then shock, and finally, a grudging, almost reluctant acceptance. Whispers erupted into murmurs, then into a cacophony of stunned discussion. Established historians, who had fiercely defended the old narrative, found themselves speechless, their arguments evaporating in the face of such absolute proof. The evidence was simply too precise, too scientifically sound, too visually undeniable to be dismissed as mere revisionism or sensationalism. Reactions from other art critics and the public, once the news inevitably broke, were equally fervent. There was awe at the technological prowess that had unearthed such a secret, and anger at the historical deception that had persisted for so long. Art critics debated the artist's complicity, or perhaps his subtle protest, in embedding such a powerful counter-narrative within his own work. The portrait's context was radically reinterpreted overnight, transforming from a celebration of an esteemed figure into a chilling commentary on the performative nature of public life in the Gilded Age. The subject's life story, once a beacon of philanthropy and moral rectitude, was scrutinized anew. Every biography, every laudatory article, every public speech now reread through the lens of this profound revelation. The consequences began to unfold with astonishing speed, cascading through academic journals, museum exhibits, and even popular media. The initial wave of pain and shock Dr. Sharma's team had felt was now mirrored across the intellectual landscape, a collective reckoning with a lost truth, and a dawning understanding of the layers of artifice that could exist beneath the most polished surfaces. This monumental discovery, however, was not the end, but merely the arduous beginning of a long and intricate process of reconstruction. The immediate aftermath saw a flurry of activity, as Dr. Sharma and her colleagues, now bolstered by newfound credibility, began the painstaking work of rewriting history. Initial scholarly papers, detailing the methodology and the implications of the finding, were drafted with intense rigor, scrutinizing every aspect of the subject's life and the era in which he lived. News articles, first tentative, then increasingly assertive, began to circulate globally, sparking a dramatic shift in public conversation. The portrait, once a static object of admiration, became a dynamic focal point for discussions on authenticity, historical bias, and the power of hidden truths. The first small victories were achieved as influential figures within the academic and artistic communities, initially resistant, publicly acknowledged the significance of the discovery. Museum curators initiated plans for new exhibits, recontextualizing the infamous portrait and its subject. University departments, once hesitant to support Dr. Sharma's unconventional approach, now sought her expertise, recognizing the profound implications for historical methodology. This was not a swift resolution, a neat tying up of loose ends, but the arduous start of a long process of rewriting history, a journey marked by both intellectual rigor and deep emotional processing. The weight of centuries of accepted narrative could not be overturned in a single day, but the first stones of a new foundation had been laid. Dr. Sharma and her team, now emerging from the shadow of academic skepticism, began to truly understand the deeper implications of their findings, not just for this specific portrait, but for the study of history itself. They recognized that every historical artifact, every revered narrative, might contain its own hidden whispers, its own silent betrayals, waiting for the right technology, the right perspective, and the right moment to be revealed. Their journey had transformed them, moving them beyond the mere pursuit of facts to a profound appreciation for the elusive, often uncomfortable nature of truth. The 1880 portrait, once a fixed point in time, now stood as a living testament to the ongoing dialogue between the past and the present, a permanent reminder that history is never truly settled, but always, in its deepest essence, a story waiting to be fully told. The echoes of that tiny inscription would resonate for generations, a testament to the enduring power of a hidden detail, forever changing how we look at the masterpieces of the past and the complex lives they sought to portray.